All right, this video lecture, it will wrap up our discussion of the role and status of women in East Asia. And then we will move on to a discussion of China in the 20th century, especially the era of the Republic of China. So to remind us where we left off, we were exploring different ways that we might recover the stories and voices of women in East Asian history. And note that I have sort of divided this up into three different frames of analysis. The first is recognizing and validating the all too prevalent discrimination and suffering that women experienced in much of East Asian history and arguably even to today. The second is emphasizing moments when women played a more prominent and active role in politics and the economy and culture and other aspects than perhaps they're given credit for. And I call this Women Were There Too. And then the third is the idea of gender, the idea of certain characteristics associated with being male or female, and how that plays out differently in different aspects of East Asia. And we left off last time discussing multiple cases that illustrate the idea of women were there too. Everything from the ancient Japanese Queen Himiko or Pimiko to the much more recent Park Geun-hye, the daughter of Park Chung-hee in South Korea, who became the president in 2013 to 2017. Another example of a prominent female figure in 20th century Asian history is Song Mei-ling. She was the second wife of the nationalist leader Chiang Kai-shek and played a very prominent role in not only the governance of China under the Republicans, under the nationalists, but also had a lot of influence on how her husband, Chiang Kai-shek, lived and ruled. She actually studied in the United States and learned how to speak English in the South and had a little bit of a Southern drawl when she spoke English. She converted to Christianity and required that Chiang Kai-shek convert to Christianity if he were to marry her. And she, in many respects, served as the public face of the nationalist government to the outside world, especially to the United States. And particularly during wartime, during the times when Japan was invading China and China was fighting against Japan. And here she is giving an address to the United States Congress and again played a very prominent and significant role in trying to improve relations between China and the United States, especially during this critical wartime moment. So those are just a few examples of important leaders and figures, people like Park Geun-hye or Song Mei-ling, or we can go back to Queen Min or the Empress Dowager Cixi and Empress Wu and so on. And here I want to step back for just a moment and note that if you step back and have a slightly broader view of not just East Asia, but also South Asia and Southeast Asia, you find that the 20th century is filled with trailblazers, with women who have risen to the highest pinnacle of political power, serving as the president or the prime minister, the top political figure in their countries. And it's interesting that if I show you their picture before I show you their name, it would be interesting for you to consider how many of these trailblazing female figures do I know, do I recognize? So here's the first one. And she's one that we've already talked about, Park Geun-hye, the first female president of South Korea. But how about this one? This is Corazon or Cory Aquino, and she was the first female president of the Philippines. Anyone recognize her? This is Megawati Soekarno-Putri, first female president of Indonesia. Here we have Khaleda Zia, first female president of Bangladesh. Indira Gandhi, first female head of state in India. And finally, Benazir Bhutto, the first female prime minister of Pakistan. And all of these figures have a few things in common, I think. The first is it's interesting to note that of these, 4 out of the 6 come from countries with very significant Muslim populations. And it's interesting that although we in the West sometimes have stereotypes about Islam and the role and status of women in Muslim societies. But it's interesting to note that in many of these significant Muslim-populated states have had female heads of state in a way that, say, the United States hasn't had. But the second thing that was interesting is that all 6 of these women, in part, owe their ascent to the top of the ladder to the fact that they were known in their respective societies because of their relationship with powerful men. In each case, it was either their father or their husband who previously had served as the head of state. So Aquino was her husband, Park Geun-hye was her father, Bhutto was her husband, Gandhi was her father, Zia was her father, I believe, and Sukarno Putri was her father. And so on the one hand, it does show what we might say in the 21st century progressive ideas about the equality between men and women. But it is interesting to note that across East Asia, more often than not, as of yet, female heads of state get to this position because of their relationship with powerful men. And so it still seems that perhaps we're not quite as equal as we might think or we might wish. But here's an interesting counterexample to the trend that I just described. Anyone recognize her? This is, of course, Tsai Ing-wen, the current head of state of Taiwan, the Republic of China on Taiwan. And unlike the other figures that we just discussed, she has no family connection, no husband or father that sort of paved the way to her visibility and legitimacy. She ascended through the ranks of her political party and then ultimately through the ranks of government in Taiwan solely on her own merits, her own abilities, and her own connections with the voters of Taiwan. And so in many respects, she I think, signals perhaps the beginning of a new era in which we do see more equality, at least in some certain circles. However, if you step back and look at things more broadly, the situation in East Asia still has quite a bit of work to do if we're going to apply, again, Western liberal 21st century notions of equality between men and women to these places. Here is an example, the Global Gender Gap Index, and noted that it's kind of dated, but uses a variety of indices, women in positions of politics, women's commanding or leading prominent companies, educational access, workforce participation, and a whole host of other factors. And unsurprisingly, Scandinavian states end up near the top of these types of indices, with, in this case, Iceland being the top. And down at the very bottom are East Asian states. The People's Republic of China comes in at number 87, Japan at 104, and South Korea at nearly the very bottom at 117. It's clear that again, we're not anywhere close to equality as measured by those types of indices, as I just indicated. And you might think, well, that's 2014. Has anything changed since then? Well, here's a different index. This is only the members of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. And so these are 29 industrialized economies in the world. But sadly, you look at the very bottom, the last 2 states, the bottom states are Japan and South Korea. I know that China is not on the list because it's not formally a member of the OECD, though it probably should be. So again, much change has happened in the 20th century, but many would argue that there's still a lot of work to be done. All right, and then finally, very briefly, a few examples of how looking at ideas and theories of gender might help us understand and recover different things in East Asia. And one is an interesting one that we've already touched upon a little bit from time to time, is the notion of beauty, and especially feminine beauty, female beauty. And one thing, if you look at East Asia and various points in East Asian history, you recognize that what constitutes female beauty changes over time and over space. That it's not a universal thing. And I think a really interesting example of this is this individual, Yang Guifei. She was the favorite concubine of an emperor in the Tang dynasty and is regarded as one of the 4 beauties of ancient China, the 4 most beautiful women who ever lived in China. And all sorts of poetry written about her, statues made of her, paintings, all sorts of things. But if you take even a cursory look, you realize that if one were to adopt 20th or early 21st century Western sensibilities of a certain type, the kind that we typically see on fashion runways, for example, Yang Guifei is not what we would call skinny. And in fact, she was known for her plumpness, if we want to call it that, and celebrated. This is something regarded as actually beautiful, and one of the top 4 most beautiful women to have ever lived in China. Sadly for Yang Guifei, her story does not end well. There was a rebellion against the imperial house of which she was a part, and the emperor had to flee. And in part because Yang Guifei was so large, they actually had trouble getting her on horses, and she kind of slowed the whole party down. And ultimately, the Tang Emperor's male officials and followers said, we're all going to die if we keep going this slowly because of your concubine. You need to kill her. And sadly, he did. But she's not the only one. Again, you remember from a couple of weeks ago, I spent some time in Boston and Salem, among other things, slipping away and going into museums. And here's another Tang era figurine, which again kind of, I think, shows how beauty standards are different over time. And they're by no means universal. Here's another example that I love, not Chinese, but rather Mongol. This is Kutulun. She was the daughter of Kublai Khan's cousin. So one of the top Mongol nobility. And she was celebrated not for her beauty, but rather for her ability to fight and her strength. And she was known, among other things, as a remarkable wrestler. So much so that when men came calling to seek her hand in marriage, she'd say, I'll make a deal with you. Let's wrestle, and if you win, then I'll marry you. And if you lose, then you have to give me 100 horses. And as the years went by, she ended up with thousands and then tens of thousands of horses because no one could beat her. And so again, a remarkable illustration of very different types of characteristics that are praised that we might not necessarily associate with femininity, at least in modern Western sensibilities. A third example comes from medieval Japan, and this was the tradition of blackening teeth, ohaguro. This is regarded as exceptionally beautiful, and women would go to great lengths to make their teeth black. And again, it raises all sorts of interesting questions about what are there any universal standards of beauty, and how different medieval Japanese cultural sensibilities were compared to, say, 21st century Western sensibilities, in which beautiful teeth are so white that they glow in the dark. We've already discussed foot binding and the interesting ramifications that has about different notions of the body and beauty and so on. And I'll simply wrap up with one more contemporary manifestation of this, and that is the fact that South Korea has become the cosmetic surgery capital of East Asia, if not the world. And there has been developed a set of physical characteristics that South Korean surgeons promise that they can have anyone obtain by going under the knife. But by causing this kind of homogenization, this uniformity of beauty in really interesting ways that has ramifications not only in South Korean society, but in East Asian society more broadly, because the South Korean popular culture, K-pop and K-dramas and so on, become more widespread. People in the region seek these kinds of beauty ideals as well. And I was really struck in a more recent trip that I took to China, how many advertisements I saw in China that were ads for South Korean style cosmetic surgery. You can come to this hospital and we will fix you up so you'll look like the South Koreans. Here was one that was even just on the back of the seat of the bus that I was in. And it's remarkable how, again, what defines maleness or femaleness, and in this case what defines feminine beauty, seems to change pretty significantly over time. All right, that concludes our discussion of the role and status of women in East Asia. There's a lot more we could and probably should cover, but that's all we can do for now. But I do want to leave you with one sort of little bit of homework assignment, and that is get out your cell phones and look at this QR code, and this will take you to a Qualtrics survey, which includes all the women that we've discussed over the last couple of sessions. And I want you to vote for which one you think should be added to our ID term list. And then I will share the results of this a little bit later. So I'll pause for just a second, give you a chance to do that. And note that if for whatever reason the QR code doesn't work here, there also is a link in the announcements tab on Learning Suite. But please take this survey and we'll kind of see what we get. Okay, moving forward then to 20th century China. My focus here is going to be primarily on the ID terms that fall within the temporal and spatial scope of 20th century China, especially the Republican period. But before I do this, I want to talk about sort of one big picture thing that begins with some of your really interesting answers to the last quiz about Fukuzawa Yukichi and his conceptions of what is civilization, what is enlightenment, and so on. I will know one thing. His surname is Fukuzawa, not Yukichi. And so if you refer to him as just Yukichi, you are assuming a level of familiarity, of intimacy that you don't have. And so when you write about figures in general, either use their surname or their entire name, but don't use just their given name. And here Wikipedia can very much be your friend in determining which of these two is the surname. And so I recommend that you do your homework moving ahead and make sure that you refer to people by their entire name or their surname rather than their given name. But many of you noted correctly that one part, at least, of Fukuzawa's definition of civilization seemed to revolve around becoming more Western, adopting Western-style civilization and culture. And this brings up a question that I've mentioned a couple of times, but I want to sort of unpack it a little bit more here. And that is the only way to become modern becoming Western? And so let's start with this picture. And I want you to contemplate for a minute, who are we looking at here? And for those that are wondering, on the left is then Japanese Prime Minister Abe Shinzo. He has since stepped down and then unfortunately been assassinated just not too long ago. And then U.S. President Barack Obama. But what I want you to think about is if you were to describe the clothing those two men are wearing, how would you describe them? What would you say? Are they wearing modern clothing? Are they wearing Western clothing? What precisely would you say? And I dare say many of us would say, well, they're wearing a Western-style suit or a Western-style business suit and so on. That Abe, in doing this, in putting on a Western-style suit, he is somehow not being fully, authentically Japanese. That in order to become modern, he has to adopt Western styles of doing things because, Japanese traditionally didn't wear this kind of suit. And many of us say, this is the kind of thing we expect traditional Japanese clothing to look like. And yet, if you think about this a little bit and you sort of explore the historical trajectories of clothing over time in Japan, you have to come to the conclusion that Abe Shinzo wore the Western-style suit his entire adult life. Except for maybe a few ceremonial occasions, that is what he wore every day when he got up and he went to work. And not only did he wear it his entire life, so did his father. So here's a picture of the Abe family, and little Shinzo is there sitting on his mother's lap. But there's his father. And what's he wearing? A Western-style suit. Abe Shinzo's father was also a politician and diplomat. Here he is meeting with Ronald Reagan in the 1980s. And what's he wearing? A Western suit. And indeed, you have to go all the way back to his grandfather to find what we would think of as more traditional Japanese clothing being worn. But even here, this is misleading because this is a special occasion. This is his wedding. And indeed, many Japanese did dress up in what is regarded as more traditional Japanese clothing for particular festive or ceremonial occasions like weddings. But Abe's grandfather, too, for most of his adult life and in most situations, wore a Western-style suit. And it goes back even more. Because you can go all the way back to the Meiji Restoration, 1868, where many Japanese, especially elites, consciously adopted either Western-style military attire or Western-style suits. And so one has to ask the question, if Abe has worn this entire his life, and his father has worn it in his entire life, and his grandfather has worn it his entire life, is it still Western? How long does a culture or a people need to adopt something new before it becomes their own? Before we just talk about being modern or international and not focus only on the place of its origin. This is a question for which I don't think there's a single answer or an answer that everyone will agree upon, but it is something I think we need to think about a little bit. And here's a somewhat amusing counterexample. Here's an American, the University of Chicago anthropologist Frederick Starr, who devoted most of his life to studying Japan. He spent a lot of time in Japan doing field work and research and meeting with Japanese academics and so on. And among other things, he became famous for, when he was in Japan, always wearing kimono, always wearing traditional Japanese-style robes. And so here's a photo of him and also a Japanese sort of print of him, again, wearing sort of Japanese-style clothing. Here he is riding in a rickshaw, again, wearing kimono and so on. And it's fine if he wants to affect this. But in many cases, when he would meet with his Japanese academic counterparts, he would sometimes be the only one or one of a very few that are wearing kimono and robes, whereas all the other Japanese academics were wearing suits. And in fact, there's this really amusing moment when he wanted to join a group of Japanese academics to visit the Ise Shrine, this really significant shrine in the history of Shinto in Japan that we've talked about before. And when they get to the entrance, the managers of the shrine tell Starr, you can't come in because you aren't dressed properly. They let all of the supposedly Western-style suit-wearing Japanese academics in, but Starr had to change his clothes. And so again, we have to ask the question, when does it become not Western, but modern or international? And you certainly give people in Japan and China and Korea the possibility of changing their cultures with the times and not necessarily giving up their authentic culture. Because after all, if we insist that Japanese must always wear kimono or they're not authentically Japanese, then Barack Obama should dress up like this because it's what Americans used to wear. And most of us would say, no, that's not how it works. That you can change with the times, you can become modern and still be yourself and still be true to your identity. I think this is true both in the United States and the West, but also true in East Asia. And I will note one other sort of interesting angle to this. Even as many men across the world increasingly adopted either Western-style military attire or the Western-style business suit, and wore it in so many places and for so long in so many different contexts that it ultimately becomes international, becomes modern. Women is a different story. In many societies, women were expected to be the repository and the keepers of authenticity and tradition. And hence the switch to more Western-style clothing instead of, say, the hanbok in the case of Korea or the kimono in case of Japanese women was much slower because there was this expectation that women need to stay true to the authentic culture of their past in a way that the men didn't necessarily have to be. And then finally, one last analogy that I like to use that I think hits this point home pretty closely. Here's a picture of a wheat farm in Minnesota. And when we think about this, we say, what kind of agriculture is this farmer practicing? And many of you should say, well, he's growing wheat. Or we might even say he's practicing American agriculture. After all, the American national anthem praises America for being its amber waves of grain and so on. Not the national anthem, but America the Beautiful, excuse me. But nonetheless, where did wheat originate? Mesopotamia, the Fertile Crescent. And so do we say this Minnesota farmer is practicing Iraqi agriculture or Mesopotamia agriculture? No, he's just farming. In the same way, I think that one can become modern, even if some of the aspects of modernity didn't originate in the place where you're from. It's certainly something that we allow generally for societies and people and culture in the West, and we should probably do the same for the East, for East Asia. All right, that's a big picture thing. Let's talk about Republican China, the period after the Qing is overthrown and a new government, a republic is instituted at the very end of 1911 or the beginning of 1912, and your short response papers on this are really interesting. And here again, I want to emphasize the ID terms that fall under this period. And so the first one is this gentleman, Sun Yat-sen, the founding father of the Republic of China. He is one of the few figures that both the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Republic of China on the mainland, they like him, and they claim that they are his heir. And so here is a celebration celebrating 100 years after the beginning of the revolution, 1911, and there's Sun Yat-sen's portrait right there in the middle. From time to time, it's not a permanent thing, but one time when I was in Beijing in Tiananmen Square, facing across the square the giant portrait of the Chinese Communist leader Mao Zedong was this giant portrait of Sun Yat-sen. Very clearly, the PRC wants to say we are the heirs to Sun Yat-sen and his vision. But so does the Republic of China on Taiwan. And here is the Sun Yat-sen shrine or mausoleum. Not mausoleum, he wasn't buried there. Shrine. At one point, it was the largest Asian-style roofed building in the world. I'm not sure if it still is. But the nationalists and the Republic of China on Taiwan also say we are true to Sun Yat-sen. So who was this guy? He was born in southern China, but he spent a lot of time overseas. He studied in Hong Kong and then later Hawaii. And when I was in Honolulu, I stumbled across a statue of him. I was happy to see him there. And he studied and became a doctor. He also converted to Christianity. But then he returns to China and says that, the problem China is facing more than anything else is that it's ruled by these foreigners, these Manchus. And so we need to oppose the Qing and restore the Ming. That was sort of his watchword. And he tried multiple times and failed multiple times. And so much so that the Qing wanted to kill him, and he spent a lot of time abroad in exile in places like Japan, Great Britain, or even the United States. And so I've mentioned this before, but ironically, when the 1911 revolution unfolds, that brings about the beginning of the end of the Qing, Sun is nowhere to be found. He's in Denver. But he quickly returns to China, and the rebels say, you are a figure with international visibility and legitimacy. We want you to be the president of the new Republic of China. And Sun Yat-sen agrees. And it's interesting that even though his slogan and his main motivation for revolutionary change was we need to get rid of the Manchus, we need to oppose the Qing and restore the Ming, this didn't really mean return to the territory and the people governed by the Ming. Because the Chinese nation in the Republic ended up being everything that the Manchus had conquered. And so this is an early flag of the Republic of China. It later changed to ones that we're more familiar with. But it has 5 stripes, 5 different colors. And this represents the 5 constituent peoples of the early Republic of China. Han Chinese, who made up the majority of the population, but also Manchus, Mongols, Hui, which means Muslims, but also Uyghurs and others in Xinjiang, and Tibetans. And so much like the Qing was this large, expanded, multicultural, multi-ethnic empire, the Republic of China said, we want to overthrow the Qing, but we want to keep everything they conquered. That is now China. And that is, of course, where we get the PRC's present policy of being a multi-ethnic, multilingual polity with lots of Han Chinese, to be sure, but also 55 other minority peoples. Sun Yat-sen advocated for what he called the 3 people's principles. These are nationalism, democracy, and people's livelihood. What this meant to him kind of changed over time, and as he got older, more and more it seemed a bit more socialist or communist, and this is one of the reasons why the Chinese Communist Party and the PRC like Sun Yat-sen a lot. But nonetheless, both the ROC on Taiwan and the PRC on the mainland say we are the true heirs to Sun Yat-sen and his 3 people's principles. But back in 1912, Sun Yat-sen had a problem. He didn't have an army. And he realized that there was no real way he could rule over this new China without military backing. And so he agreed to turn power over to one of the leading generals of the time, a guy by the name of Yuan Shikai, in the hopes that Yuan would do all of the modernizing reforms and support and install democracy in the way that Sun Yat-sen and many of the other reformers wanted. Unfortunately for them, Yuan Shikai didn't want to do that. In fact, he tried to bring back the empire with himself as emperor, but then died soon after this in 1916. But he left in his wake chaos. And for the next several years, even decades, even though there technically was a government of the Republic of China, in reality, China was ruled by warlords, different military figures that had their own armies, that collected their own taxes, and at best paid minimal tribute to the central government in Beijing. And they would form coalitions with each other and fight wars with each other. And so here's sort of what the map looks like in 1924 and how it shifts in just a couple of years in 1926. But clearly China at this point was fragmented, much like it was after the fall of the Han Dynasty or after the fall of the Tang Dynasty. And many thought that one of the key challenges that China was facing was how to overcome this fragmentation and become unified again. So here is a political cartoon from the time, rather gruesome, I apologize, but it displays the twin challenges faced by the oppressed people of China during this period. One, the monopoly man there represents imperialists, because this is still the era of humiliation, and there still are the treaty ports and concessions and extraterritoriality and all the other things that were imposed beginning with the Opium War and the Treaty of Nanking in 1842. But then to the right of the imperialist is a warlord. And it's these individual military commanders that want their own power more than they want the greatness and unity of the Chinese people. And so a real question in much of early 20th century China is, how do we solve these dilemmas? Foreign imperialism, local fragmentation, and warlords. And there were many different groups that said, we have the answers to this. But a lot of them emerge out of a really critical moment in the early history of the Republic, and that is the May 4th protests and the subsequent May 4th movement that emerged from it. So this is 1919. This is another one of your ID terms. If you'll remember, in the late Qing, there wasn't a lot of territory that was directly annexed by foreign imperialists. Yes, you had Hong Kong annexed by the British and then Taiwan after 1895 by the Japanese, but the mass majority of China still technically was under the control of the Qing. But various foreign powers established what they called spheres of influence, areas where they had special access and special privileges. So you've got the French in the south, the British in the Yangtze River, the Russians in the north, and so on. And we mentioned this before, but one interesting latecomer to this game were the Germans, who established a sphere of influence in the Shandong Peninsula, and especially the city of Qingdao. And here is what the German colonial leader, the German colonial official, governor built a huge house for himself. It cost so much money that he got fired and sent home. But also walking the streets of Qingdao in 1993, I was surprised and a bit amused to see, among other things, this giant statue of a mermaid holding aloft a beer stein. Not terribly Chinese, but when you recognize the German presence in this area of China, you recognize sort of what's going on here. Well, when World War I broke out, and Germany is one of the key figures in the Central Powers, China, the Republic of China, joined the Allies, fighting against Germany, and volunteered to send troops to Europe to fight in the war. But the Allied powers, especially France, said, no, we don't want lots of Chinese soldiers with guns on our soil. But they did accept Chinese workers. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese workers went to France and supported the war effort behind the lines, helping work in factories and helping supply lines and other things like that. In many cases, they were close enough to the front lines to be subjected to artillery barrages and other things, and Chinese died in World War I. But the expectation was that once the Allies win, this German sphere of influence in China would naturally be given back to China. But what happened in the Paris Peace Treaty wasn't the return of Shandong to China. Rather, it was given to another Allied power, Japan. And this really angered a lot of people in China, and especially young idealistic students, who said, this is just wrong, this is unfair. We thought that American President Woodrow Wilson was coming to the Paris peace talks to help make the world safe for democracy. And we thought that they were all about self-determination of peoples. And we want self-determination. We want to be able to determine our own destiny and not be humiliated and dominated by foreign powers. And yet here, our own territory, the sphere of influence, is handed over from one foreign power, Germany, to another, Japan. And so this caused lots of students and others to take to the streets of protest in Tiananmen Square in Beijing, among other places, and really sort of galvanize a new generation of leaders and thinkers, all trying to figure out how can China get out of this predicament of weakness and humiliation. And in the mind and memories of many, these are sort of the forerunners to later reformist and even revolutionary groups that ultimately end in the establishment of the PRC in 1949. So the May 4th movement describes both this historical moment when students took to the street to protest the injustice of the outcome of the end of World War I. But the same label, May 4th, is also attached to a wider set of intellectual and reform movements and publications where thinkers and writers were saying, what do we need? What's the solution to these twin challenges of imperialism and decentralization, fragmentation, warlordism? Some of these May 4th intellectuals were liberals. They wanted more Western-style democracy, Western-style science. This seemed to be the way to change things. Others were writers and poets, wanted to change China by their pen, much like Confucian scholars had done in centuries and millennia past. And some were socialists, saw that the real way out of the imperialist predicament is to foment revolution, much like as was unfolding in Russia at the time. And so out of this heady mix of May 4th intellectual ferment, and there were all sorts of ideas across the board, two groups emerge, the nationalists and the communists. And both of them say, we have the solutions to China's problems. And even though they end up being mortal enemies, they actually share some really interesting similarities, especially early on when they first were being formed. The first is, surprisingly, the Soviet Union supported both of them as sort of anti-imperialist movements. The second is both the nationalists, the Kuomintang, and the communists, the Gongchangdang, had the same sort of political ideology and structure that was modeled after what Soviet leader Vladimir Ilyich Lenin advocated. And that was, among other things, that the party is the most significant unit in the polity. And so the most powerful person in a socialist party structure is the party secretary. It's not the president. It's not the leader of the country. It's the leader of the party. And both the nationalists and the communists organized their political organizations this way. They both declared that one of their chief goals was to struggle against foreign imperialism and humiliation. And from time to time, they cooperated. First in the mid-1920s, and then again during the war with Japan. And so here's a little picture of Chiang Kai-shek and Mao Zedong in a brief moment when they adopted a united front against the foreigners, against the Westerners, against the Japanese. So let's break down a little bit these two groups. The first are the nationalists, again, the Kuomintang, KMT or GMD. And while technically founded by Sun Yat-sen, the primary leader of them was this guy, Chiang Kai-shek. Your textbook sometimes calls him Jiang Jie-shi, but that's using sort of standard Mandarin pronunciation, and that's not how he pronounced his name. He pronounced it Chiang Kai-shek. But he takes over in 1925, 1926, and rules the party until he dies in 1975. And the types of things he thought that China needed were really glorifying the military. And that's why he liked to dress up in military uniforms, and he styled himself a generalissimo. But he thought that the military's devotion to the nation, you give up your life for your nation, but also military order and discipline, these were the kinds of things that China needed. But he also thought that China's past had some answers for China's predicament, particularly in Confucianism. And he advocated for various Confucian values like filial piety and loyalty. But he also was a Christian. Again, Song Mei-ling would not marry him unless he converted. Some have thought that this conversion was only skin deep. He didn't really care about Christianity. But I will note that there's been some more recent work that have gone through his diaries, things that he's writing ostensibly only to himself or maybe to posterity. And there it seems that maybe he took his Christian faith a bit more seriously than had previously been thought. And then finally, interestingly, Chiang Kai-shek observed what was happening in Europe, especially in Mussolini's Italy and a bit later Hitler's Germany, and thought that the fascists had some real answers for the dilemmas that many peoples faced in the early 20th century. And so until the outbreak of the Second World War and the division of the Allies and the Axis, there actually was quite a bit of cooperation between Chiang Kai-shek's nationalists and Nazi Germany. And this is sort of a little fact that is sort of brushed over because most of our memories of the nationalists come from wartime when the nationalists were the United States ally fighting against the Nazis. But Chiang Kai-shek saw some merit in some fascist ideas and institutions. In 1926, Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists start from their bases in the south and engage in what is known as the Northern Expedition. They march north and conquer warlords along the way and overthrow the government in Beijing and establish a new government with its capital in Nanjing, and ushers in what is known as the Nanjing Decade, this decade in which the Nationalists ostensibly had control of all of China, ruling from the southern capital, though in reality warlords still wielded a lot of power. And so he brings together his military ideas, his Confucian ideas, his Christian ideas, his fascist ideas. He, with the barrel of a gun, imposes his rule over much of China and seeks to modernize it and reform it and make it stronger. His chief enemy were the communists. And they too were part of this May 4th movement that said we need to rethink what it is that China needs. And there were all sorts of communist thinkers and founders and so on. For our purposes, the most significant one is the one that ultimately rises up to the top and founds the PRC in 1949, and that's Mao Zedong. He definitely was a committed revolutionary. He thought that what China needed was to overthrow the old order, the old ways of thinking, the old class structure, the old traditions. And he tried to do this time and time again throughout his life. But he also was a Chinese nationalist. He wanted China to be great. He wanted China to stand up, not be humiliated and bullied anymore, and arguably to some degree accomplished this after 1949, and has been remembered and revered by Chinese people for this accomplishment ever since. He came from a peasant background, grew up in a farming household, though as he got a little bit older, his dad became a merchant, became a little richer, though this part of the story is not told in the PRC today all that much. But he liked to think that he understood the vast majority of Chinese people, farmers, peasants. He understood how they thought, he understood what made them tick, and he could connect with them. One of his most famous statements is political power comes from the barrel of a gun. In other words, the only way you can really bring about change is through power and violence, and was more than willing to use it to accomplish his revolutionary aims. So Mao Zedong was one of many communists who moved to the countryside and worked with farmers to establish what were called rural Soviets. And his base was in the province of Jiangxi. And there they would try to take land away from landlords and give it to the people that actually tilled the land, and work in other ways to sort of reform and overthrow the class structure of the old society and create a new one. Chiang Kai-shek and the Nationalists did not like this, and so they sought to march in and liquidate these rural Soviets, and successfully did so one by one until Mao's rural Soviet in Jiangxi was about the only one left. In this contest between the Nationalists and the Communists, it seems like the Nationalists had almost won. And as they moved to surround and liquidate the last rural Soviet in Jiangxi, Mao and his fellow Red Army and Socialist followers run away in what is known as the Long March. Another ID term, 1934-1935. And so basically recognizing that if they stay in Jiangxi, they're going to be destroyed, they march from Jiangxi all the way through western China, then all the way up north to Shanxi province, to the city of Yan'an, which was, because of geography and the various local warlords, more or less beyond the reach of the Nationalists. And so it was a way for the communists to survive, to regroup, and fight another day. And this is one of these iconic moments in today's Chinese history. All Chinese school children learn about the Long March and know about some of the particulars and the details and some of the lessons that can be learned from it. So here are the details as far as we know. Mao and his fellow communist soldiers and revolutionaries marched for more than a year, 370 days. They covered about 3,000 miles. And while there were different moments along the way, at the beginning of this, something like 100,000 or even as many as 200,000 troops begin this march, but only 8,000 reach Yan'an. The vast majority desert or die. But of these 8,000, they become the core leadership of the party, and therefore the core leadership of the PRC after 1949 for decades. The Long March veterans are sort of the They've bonded together. They survived all these hardships, and they can count on each other, and again become the leaders of the party and of the People's Republic of China after 1949. Some have made the comparison to LDS history with Zion's camp, marching together through difficult things and therefore becoming this bonded leadership that later leads the organization. It's interesting to note that these are the details as far as we can tell based on the best available historical sources. But the PRC today exaggerates things just a bit. They claim that the Long March covered 25,000 li, which is about 8,000 miles. So close to 3 times as far as they actually marched. And while some historians, even in the PRC, have attempted to push back against this, say, look at the map, there's no way that's 8,000 miles. The official line is the 25,000 li of the Red Army's Long March are a historic fact and not open to doubt. You can't argue against this. There also is a lot of emphasis on the so-called 8 points of attention. These were rules given to the Red Armies as they marched through various parts of China. Basically, don't take things from the local population without paying for it. Don't attack or molest women. Just be very good, sincere, and kind soldiers, and don't get the local populace mad at you. And there's some evidence that in many cases the Long Marchers tried to do this, but there are also other accounts where perhaps they fell a little bit short of these lofty ideals. But those moments and those stories are not part of the official narrative. So here are some of the soldiers marching, and even though it's always called the Long March, of course Mao is special. He's different. He didn't march; he rode, and everyone's equal except some are more equal than others, I guess. But again, this is one of those moments that has been re-emphasized and really a part of the Chinese historical imagination. And so here is a contemporary Chinese scholar, Sun Chuyun, who applies the lessons of the Long March to other challenges that the people of China face today. She says, if you find it hard, think of the Long March. If you feel tired, think of our revolutionary forebears. The message has been drilled into us that we can accomplish any goal set before us by the party because nothing compares in difficulty with what they did. Decades after the historical one, we have been spurred on to ever more long marches, to industrialize China, to feed the largest population in the world, to catch up with the West, to reform the socialist economy, to send men into space, to engage with the 21st century. And so you can see sort of how central and how important this particular moment is in the historical imagination, especially in the People's Republic of China on the mainland. And you also don't have to think very long and hard without seeing a lot of parallels between this and LDS discourse about the pioneers and sort of how that fits in our particular narratives in a very similar way. So these two forces are arrayed against each other, the nationalists and the communists. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, neither one is able to entirely conquer the other, and it's only in 1949 that the nationalists have to flee the mainland to Taiwan, ceding the rest of China to the communists, and then the PRC is established. And while we might think that there are really clear lines that divide the nationalists and the communists, as is often the case, history is never quite that simple, and this can be illustrated in one sort of interesting question. Of the two leaders of these movements, Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists, or Mao Zedong and the communists, which one studied in Moscow? The fact that I'm asking this sort of implies that it's a trick question, but the answer is Chiang Kai-shek. And so even though he ends up being a pretty staunch anti-communist, he actually had a lot of close ties with the Soviets early on and actually spent some time studying at a Moscow institution of higher learning. Whereas the revolutionary socialist Mao Zedong never did. And so again, these things are always a bit more complicated and murky than we might initially think. All right, that ends our discussion of Republican China. The next video lecture will talk about the growing Japanese Empire and how all three places, Japan, Korea, and China, are affected by this growing empire.